It's a joy and a pleasure. I wonder, in your bio, you mentioned that you also host a podcast, and I
Oh,
wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what you chat about there.
yeah. So probably a little unlike other podcasts, and maybe unlike what we're used to hearing from therapy and therapists. But the podcast was actually the idea of my producer Jody Martinson, who's a CBC producer. She's Emmy winning. She's so gifted, and her idea was how do we demystify mental health and therapy? How come is it that all of our therapeutic insights, our gains, our struggles happen in these private worlds and in such a way kind of isolate us from each other and give us the perception of feeling like we're the only ones who think that way or talk that way or have that struggle, and can there be something gained from bringing people into that inner sanctum, that private world.
Mm.
And so the podcast Other People's Problems is is really me just doing therapy with my patients. And we have microphones in sessions and we just do therapy as normal. And then people consent to it, obviously, right? They have a choice to say that, yes, I
Yeah.
want this recorded and I want this
Sure.
shared. And then the episode is crafted by reducing the audio down and me putting a little bit of voiceover in to explain what I'm doing and why. But
Mm.
really what we found from people is that it really undoes the aloneness around so many of the mental health struggles that we have, and I think really shifts the perception that therapy is for the people with really acute mental illness, air quotes, like the people who are
Yeah.
over there who are unlike me, and reminds us that therapy gets to be for everybody and can include not just the things that we identify as being really challenging, but can be a way to work on relational skills and feel seen and witnessed, even in the beautiful things in our life.
I love that. Ben, that
Mm.
reminds me of a podcast you turned me on to by Esther Perel.
Mm.
Hillary, do you know Esther Perel?
Not personally, no.
Um, Ben, what's the name of that podcast where
I
she
think it's
does
Where
something?
Should We Begin?
Where should we
Yeah.
begin?
Yeah. She
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
records a therapy session and then intersperses it with her comments sort of as she reflects on the session
Yeah.
herself. And sometimes it's really interesting because sometimes she'll be like, I wish I would have done this here, or I missed this, that kind of thing is very fascinating.
Mm.
Hmm. It's wild to think about what's in the collective unconscious. Our podcast came out at the same time, and without
Oh,
us knowing
interesting.
about
Oh,
what
that's
the other was
interesting.
going
Yeah.
within a few months of each other. And obviously I'm sure it was the case for her too. We'd been working on ours for about 3 years, trying to get ethical checks done and
Yeah.
kind of legal things and journalistic
Yeah.
standards of practice. And so to have them come out at the same time is like, wow, there's
That's
like something
fascinating.
shifting in the mental health world and how we're really trying to demystify this. It's necessary, obviously.
Yeah.
Love that.
Well, in many ways, Hillary, the book that we're discussing today, your latest book, Practices for Embodied Living, Experiencing the Wisdom of Your Body. As I read this book and sort of participated with the book, I did feel
Mm-hmm.
like I was sitting somewhat with you. Um, there's an accompanying that this book communicates and invites me into. And I wonder if you could just talk about maybe the medium of writing a book and how oftentimes there's a distance between what you're reading and the person who's writing it, or it's not the same as being in a room or even being here on a video chat talking about the book.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess, was it intentional as you wrote this that the reader would feel accompanied by you? And if so, how did you set about to do that?
Thank you for asking that. And it feels so moving to know that that's how you experienced it, because that's exactly what I would want. And I think there's something about the format of it, which is that it's meant to be experiential. The prompts, the questions, the things that I write are meant to provoke a reaction or an experiment or an experience. And I think that we don't often write in that way. We don't often read in that way. We kind of see this, writing as this transcribed soliloquy, and this is meant to be a series of doorways that you open or keys that I hand you. And so there's something very interactive about that you get to decide, what do I want to answer this question? Do I want to do it now? Oh, someone's asking me. Like, I'm speaking directly to you as I write. I'm writing directly to you. I want for you to try this. I want for you to know this.
Mm.
So I think that is meant to take this book from being just this really cerebral cognitive endeavor into
Mhm.
something that feels embodied and relational, which is really the whole point of the material.
Yeah.
I want people to have a felt sense of something. They want it to feel like it happens in a relational context.
Yeah. And I had some maybe trepidation about that,
Mm-hmm.
and in the sense of one of sort of my life goals these last few years is to take my body more seriously as a place of knowledge and intimacy and memory and all that. And I was like, am I going to be able to get in touch with that? Because I have a little bit of anxiety about that or fear about that, I think. But there's a statement at the beginning of your book that arrested me in a way, and it
Mm.
was the statement: "There is more wisdom in the hands holding this book than in the pages of the book the hands are holding." And my body reacted intensely to that.
Mm.
Um, I w- I wanted to protest it, Hillary.
Mm.
Like, you're the expert here, right?
Mm.
Like, that's why I got your book. Um, but I wonder if you could. But as I read, I feel like that I was opened up to the truth in that statement. I wonder if you could
Mm.
talk a bit about what you mean by that statement and why it's important to reckon with that if we're going to get in touch or be more present and embodied.
Yeah. I think that we exist in cultures that are constantly reminding us that there's somebody who knows more than us, and we get really used to that hierarchy. Someone's the guru, someone's the pastor, someone's the teacher. And there's often a story that goes along with that, I think, in faith-based contexts or religious contexts, wherein you can't know, you can't trust yourself
Yeah.
because what's inside is really dangerous and bad. And
Yeah.
so therefore, um, what gets outsourced is a kind of spiritual authority, that somebody else gets to know more and that somebody else does know more, and it's because actually you're untrustworthy that
Mm.
that they know more, and therefore you need to defer to them and their insight and their wisdom.
Mm.
And I think that that's part of what's created these schisms in the first place between within us that we carry around, is that we, for whatever reason, whether it's been because of our trauma or a cultural story or gender or a religious context, many of us live with the legacy of being told that what's inside of us is bad and can't be trusted. And so therefore we have a like a pattern or a predisposition in a way to look elsewhere,
Mhm.
as if elsewhere knows everything and has all of the insight.
Yeah.
And we forget that, well, one, I think that that system has really been co opted in a way to keep power in the hands of certain people.
Hmm.
Like if we mistrust ourselves and we don't look inside, then other people will have us continuing to defer to them as the sources of insight or guidance or spiritual authority. And it works for
Mm.
them, right? People benefit from that. And I think when we look at what's inside, that it requires us to actually interrupt those systems. Like I'm thinking about systems of patriarchy and hierarchies of dominance and authoritarianism. I'm thinking about even looking at the way that we colonize the land and our patterns of existing so much in the idea of somebody else being superior. There's kind of like a dissolving of the hierarchy that happens when we say, whoa, what's inside and what do I know and what do I start to do about that? That moves us both into awareness of the goodness
Mhm.
inside, but also moves us into a sense of responsibility taking. Like, oh, actually, there's a whole bunch of information happening here that I need to get to know and understand how to be in relationship with. And simply me saying, like, oh, you're reading this book because you want to reenact that pattern of someone else knowing more than you. Like, no, I'm just going to start from the front and
Yeah.
say, we're not doing that here. I'm just
Yeah.
going to hand it back to you and say, like, every chapter is like, what's happening inside of you? Try this.
Yeah.
What do you think? Come back. You get to be, you get to have autonomy. You get to have agency. You get to have choice. And I'm not going to rescue you from the distress you feel inside about that. And I'm not going to tell you that I have all the information or the answers about how it is to be you in your body in the world. And it's meant to be like in some ways like a wink or a nod to any other kinds of ways of being that invert these systems that keep us disconnected from ourselves and from each other.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how we get disconnected from ourselves and from each other, because it's kind of a funny, I mean, if you think about it, it's a funny thing to say that we could be like disconnected from our bodies, because there's so like
Yeah.
it's hard to even imagine what a human being would be without a body, right? So it's like, how do we get disconnected from this, these flesh and bones that are so integral to who we are? I mean, I'm thinking about this, I guess, because that was sort of I've learned this, recently, but like my strategy growing up was to sort of just ignore these emotions that were happening in my body, and sort of become unaware of them because they were uncomfortable. I didn't know what to do with them. And I actually work with, in spiritual direction and coaching and just pastoral counseling. I work with quite a few people who would say the same thing. They're just like, I don't know what I'm feeling. And so I don't know, what are some of the things that cause this? Like, people saying that, I feel disembodied, or I feel like I could crawl out of my skin, or, what are some sources of that experience that contribute to this sense of estrangement and distance from our own bodies?
I'm so glad that you set that question up the way you did too, just before I answer the question, because I think you're actually getting to the heart of this, which is that we're never actually disconnected from our body. We just learn to funnel the awareness of what's happening in our body so far away from our consciousness, like so far away from where we spend time and how we identify, that we perceive our bodies as not being there or not giving us information.
Interesting.
And we can say that that's both a narrative thing that happens and kind of a value thing, but that at times can be a psychobiological thing as well, when what's happening in the body is so overwhelming that this mechanism starts getting enacted. We call it dissociation. It's often mediated by this change in how neural projection happens based on integration between different lobes in your brain. And there's like an endogenous opiate mediated component, which is similar to about 8 milligrams of morphine. Like when something is overwhelmed, something is overwhelming, your system kind of self-administers about 8 milligrams of morphine, which creates this, again, endogenous opiate release and dissociated phenomena. So it's actually like not feeling anything, right? So you could have like, I don't care to notice. I'm disavowing from it. I'm not going to pay attention. My energy is elsewhere, or actually kind of like bottom up, just not sensing anything. But it's all there, right? Body's still there, right? You're still walking around. You're still feeding yourself. You're still sleeping. You're still probably going to notice if you stub your toe, maybe.
Right.
So it's like,
maybe.
Maybe. Yeah. But we can look in the research literature to see kind of 3 categories of things that result in this disconnection. And they would be the social, the cognitive, and the physical. And you could further break those down and say, okay, the physical, like we might have experiences that feel pretty overwhelming for our bodies, like trauma would fit into that category. Maybe there's something about the sensations in our body, like sometimes people who have chronic illness, chronic pain, even things like allergies, autoimmune stuff, right? Your body might just be overwhelmed with sensation that's hard to be with. And so it becomes easier to go, I'm just not going to go there. I'm just not going to feel that. I'm not going to spend time there. We have the cognitive pieces, like the stories that we tell, and often those are introjects. Those are things that get inserted into our stories based on the context we're in. So if you think about a religious context, people actually saying, your body is bad. People with authority who you've been learned to, again, defer to as having authority over you are saying, don't trust your body. Your body's bad. It's going to keep you away from God. Well, right, all of a sudden we have a pretty compelling inner narrative that says, don't listen, don't listen, don't listen. Right? That's bad, that's bad, that's bad. And then we have the social piece, which really looks at the distribution of power. And perhaps there's a sense of, if I'm connected to my body, then I'm on the outside of this group. Like a really good example of this would be kind of how embodied presentation across racial lines emerges. Like if you think about how often, let's say, Black women have to deal with the trope of the angry Black woman narrative. And so let's say if the Black woman is connecting to, or needs to be connected to, people who are white and hold white supremacist ideals, and connecting to her anger is going to threaten her safety, then maybe the sense of like, I'm going to shove this down is a way to stay safe, but it means disconnecting from the body. Or if we look at queer folks who are often thinking about code switching in social contexts, kind of like, I'm going to suppress the expression of my queerness because it actually makes my body be unsafe in social spaces where violence would be enacted on me. So I'm going to kind of disconnect from that. I'm going to learn to play the role of the straight person or the cis person or whatever. I'm going to move that awareness, the impulse to do anything else. I'm going to move it away, and that allows me to stay safe in this power hierarchy.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gosh, I want to ask about 36 questions about all that, Hillary.
There's so much here, right?
There's
It's like
so much.
it's so
Yeah,
much.
it's really, I think I'll just, one comment I'll make, I guess, about what you've said, Hillary, is that I think one of the big paradigm shifts for me that was so helpful for me in learning to pay attention to what my body was doing was that, like disconnecting from my body almost always is this survival mechanism, right? It's almost always some sort of narrative, or like you were saying, like a cultural reality. There's something that something feels threatening, and this is a way for me to feel safe, and it allowed me to have some compassion for myself for sort of doing this, you know what I mean? Like, why, why did I let this happen, or how could I, that kind of narrative gets interrupted by, oh, I was just trying to keep myself safe. Like, that's pretty universal. We're all trying to stay safe, and survive. And that was just really, I guess, a helpful realization for me that I heard in what you were naming there.
There's so much compassion that can be engendered by understanding this as like the only thing that we knew how to do, the only thing that could have been done at that time.
Yeah.
And I think that the thing that I'll add in there too is where we can start to talk about the intersection between safety and power, and how sometimes what we're also trying to do is stay safe by being like the people who have the most power.
Yes.
And what's interesting is what that cuts us off from, but then at times how we benefit from that, right? We become safe, but also, oh, now I can be this person who's showing this dominance with my body, or this telling this story about the way that I express my gender or whatever, in such a way that, what am I doing to somebody else in their body? And how the thing that kept us safe becomes the thing that gets us power, that becomes the thing that hurts someone else. It's like, oh, you can start to pull that string, and there's a lot that can begin to unravel. But I think it can be, if we work backwards from that, we can see perhaps all of the people who have power in a way that they inflicted on other people. We can trace that back to some origin of, I bet that they were just trying to stay safe too. And wow, under all of that facade, I wonder if there's a lot of fear there too. I wonder if there's a lot of disconnection, and it can kind of dismantle the illusion of the power as being impenetrable or like earned.
Yes. Yeah. That was, that's exactly, I think, the thread that I started thinking about as well. That has been another paradigm shift for me, is recognizing that even the people that sort of irritate or make me angry at the way they're hurting people and using power, like, it's all at the base just fear. They're just so afraid. They're so afraid. And that, I think that helps me to, I guess, it helps me to deal more adequately with the situation, if I can recognize that. So anyway.
Well said.
Hillary, I wonder if we could maybe pivot to talk through the pedagogy of practices, maybe how practices educate and transform, because it's a little different, right? We're talking here, and we can see each other, and I think seeing each other helps in this conversation because it's nice to see bodies and see facial expressions, etc. But there's a way in which just listening to this podcast, if Hillary were to say to the listener, hey, be more at home in your body, like someone couldn't just make that decision cognitively, right? So what can you talk through how practices are, the power of practices, and why they're important if we're going to appropriate sort of this homecoming that you summon us to in this book?
Yeah. I think it requires us to dismantle the idea that learning is a cerebral or cognitive endeavor exclusively, and really demands us to remember that so much of the learning that happens in life is what we would call bottom up learning, is procedural learning. Like the difference between this is one of my favorite analogies to think about because it's usually so on the nose. If I said to you, like, does memorizing a recipe about the best pasta in the world tell you what it tastes like?
Right.
No, right? Like there's an experiential learning that happens when you taste it all of a sudden, and there's something novel about that, right? There's something experiential. You're getting so many more senses on board. You're getting different regions of the brain on board. But if the learning in particular is meant to be about being in the body, it's so important that we do that in an embodied way, right? In an experiential oriented way, instead of just, I'm going to tell you a story about this and assume that that means that it's going to translate down into your tissues. So I think this is strategic in that we actually know there's about 9 times more information going from body to brain than brain to body. It's pretty compelling, actually, when you look at like the amount of real estate that a person exists in, how much the nervous system attributes to everything neck down is a lot.
Wow.
And we have a story in our culture that that's not the case, right? There's so much. I think this is androcentrism at its finest. I think this perception that like the mind is the way that we learn best or orient to the world. But if any of us think about our lives and think about how much we do during the day, it's because we've had all these moments of experiential learning that have accumulated to even create the sense of self, the ease that I can sit down in the chair, that I pick up a fork and I know how to use the fork. It's not because my mom told me to memorize the 6 steps of picking up a fork when I was a kid. It's because I did it 1,000 times, right? And I learned the way to hold the fork best.
Yes.
So when we're actually trying to meet material, embodied or bottom up learning is a very, very important way of getting things really deeply encoded inside of us. But I would be really missing something if I was writing a book about embodiment and I told people to just do thinking exercises.
Just think about it,
right?
Yeah.
So right, there's kind of this confluence of like, no, I'm trying to have the parallel process meet of the mechanism of pedagogy meet the actual material in such a way that it lines up experientially and moves really deeply in.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. Well, it's impossible to go through each chapter. There's chapters on sex and gender. There's a chapter on politics. You've already mentioned the way that our bodies are scripted culturally by gender and sex and race and size and beauty, etc. But you keep coming back over and over in the book to the importance or the primacy of tending to feelings, emotions, and desires. And I wonder, Hillary, if you could speak a bit to why these are so important. Many of us, I think, from different traditions have come to believe that feelings or emotions or desires are perhaps less important than thoughts and or just bad, like ignore them. But you come back over and over again to how we need to face them and tend to them. We just lost Hillary. Ben. She just left us. Diverse intersections about how our bodies matter in the world. There's sex and gender and intimacy and pleasure. There's politically how our bodies are scripted, what our bodies mean. You already kind of referenced that. There's trauma and how stress and trauma are stored in the body. But over and over again, and you even have a chapter on this, but it comes up in other chapters too, you focus on, maybe you bring to the foreground the primacy of dealing with our feelings and emotions and desires as integral pieces of how our body works and how we experience our body. We've already referenced the practice part of this book as like the power of it. I wonder if you could give our listeners a flavor or an example of what a practice would be or an exercise would be to help us relate better or more faithfully or helpfully to our feelings and emotions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this, I won't I won't hide this fact that as a psychologist, understanding feelings and relating to feelings is a really important way of how I understand how people are motivated, how they think, how they make decisions, kind of what creates distress in our bodies, what creates aliveness. You can even think about feelings as ways that we know, ways that we come to know ourselves and know the world and care for each other. So they're central to mediating processes around mental health. I can't understate how important this, or I don't want to it couldn't be possible to overstate how important it is to talk about emotions. And so when I'm supporting people to get connected to feelings, sometimes when we don't even know what the feelings are and where they exist inside of us, it can be helpful to have a little like exposure game, so to speak, like a little way to kind of like, whoa, provoke emotions, which allows us to go, oh, whoa, that's how they move inside of us. Because each emotion has a physiological signature. Each emotion is doing a different thing and shows up in our body in a very particular way based on biophysiology, based on social communication. Like each emotion, and this is not my language, but it has an adaptive action tendency. Jaak Panksepp has said that emotions are ancestral tools for living. So if they're tools, right, with any other tool, right, you pick up a pen. It's like, what's this tool do? Well, it tells me something about what it does. If there's a point to it and it moves in a direction and something comes out the top, it's like, oh, that tells us about what it's trying to do. So let's take, for example, disgust, right? We've got a few core emotions in our body. And maybe as like a little practice around emotion, I might say, like, if you were to come to my house and you were to see in my fridge, like a really moldy, old, like leftovers. And I was to say, hey, can you run in the, grab the, those leftovers in the fridge, just pop open the top and like heat it up for us. And you were to open my fridge and you were to see that. Can you just show me for a moment kind of what would happen in your body if you opened that up and you smelled it and saw it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Okay. Matt,
Listener, we're
do you want?
making disgust faces. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. But what I described, I saw a grimace. I saw you
Yeah.
recoil. I saw a retraction in your neck. I saw this like, right, there's a closing of your orifices, quite literally, like nose shape changes, eyes change, ooh, mouth, ooh, right? We do things like that. So we could play the same game where if I put up a picture between us of a kid or someone you love, right? Someone in your family who, like, the person, maybe even one of the people you love most in the world, and I was to show you that photo, right? Think about what your body would do then, right? There would be, I see a little smile, right? Sometimes what happens is like we soften, we lean in a little bit, right? There's a feeling of warmth in our chest. So we can engage in practices like this where we're kind of playing with what the emotions do to help us get acquainted with them, just in a get to know you sense. Like, what does that feeling do? Disgust. Like, oh, it pulls my neck back. It does this thing with my mouth. It kind of like, there's inside things that happen with the emotion and there are outside things that happen with the emotion. And the more we start to get to notice those things and get to like practice with them and play with them, put a word on them, it starts to make it easier to notice them in situations where we're not just practicing and playing around. I might feel this like, oh, like this neck jolt back and my face grimace and eyes, ooh, right? And what I'm noticing is someone made a racist comment or someone made a sexist comment or someone did something really violent to another person. And I go, oh, whoa, that's my body saying I feel disgusted by the way that person treated that other person. Whoa, that tells me something about what this feels like for me and what I value.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really good. What I hear you saying is like sort of that bottom up learning, Hillary, that you mentioned before. Most of us had to learn how to be disassociated or distanced from our bodies. And we did that through practicing a lack of awareness or tuning out. And so the way back into being at home in our body is to just practice tuning in. One of the things that you're saying.
Yeah. And I think maybe the implicit thing in what I'm saying too is, you notice how I was tracking your bodies and communicating to you what I saw and reflecting that back to you, right? Like, oh, Ben, I saw like a little movement of your lip on the left half, the left side. And I saw this thing with your neck. We're not only just practicing not noticing. But I think the other side of it is that emotions and awareness of emotions is a socially dependent phenomena in our early stages of development. We
Mm.
actually require people to notice and track and then give us names for those things to help us be able to integrate all of that together in our awareness and believe that it's valuable enough to notice. And for many
Mhm.
of us, we were told, don't listen, don't pay attention, it's bad, go away, don't feel that. And so we also missed the opportunity to have someone say, oh, I just noticed something shifted inside. I saw your body move backwards and your head turned down when that kid
Mhm.
made that other comment. I'm wondering if there's something about what they said that hurt. I'm
Yeah.
wondering if this feels like ouch inside. There's a word for
Yeah.
that. We call that sadness. And to have someone notice and give us names for things creates salience, right? It tells us, like, well, this is meaningful, this is important. And it also
Yeah.
helps us remember, oh, that did happen. My mouth did move that way. My head did move that way. And we can start to become aware of those things
Yeah.
because we know even what to look for.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I noticed, Hillary, that part of my journey um, of getting more in touch with my body and doing those things has been also as a parent to help narrate and identify what my kids are
Mm-hmm.
experiencing and feeling.
Mm.
Um,
Exactly.
so shame, you're feeling shame right now. This is what shame feels like, and those kinds of things. And
Mm-hmm.
in my best days, I'm able to do that instead of me just reacting out of my own shame or my own anger, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's so much to discuss in this book, Hillary, but maybe to close, at the end of the book, you've got sort of a leader guide on
Yeah.
how someone can lead people through chapter by chapter and practices. I wonder if you have any suggestions for people who would like to start a group. I mean, I'm thinking of starting a group like this at our church
Cool.
because we've been talking about the body as a
Mm.
place of meaning and importance and understanding and communication, etc. But very little practical tools to kind of hack our way back into our bodies. And I feel like your
Right.
book
Yeah.
provides that. But I
Thank
wonder
you.
if
Yeah.
if you have any suggestions on people who want to explore this more with others, like what are some things you would recommend?
Yeah. I'm not going to get a comprehensive list, and like the list will be in the back of the book. So if you're really interested in that, for those
Mm-hmm.
listeners, like go have a look because there's recommendations about how to set it up and how to spend your time and how to assess for goodness of fit and managing the environment and talking about the group with others. So all of that stuff is there. But I think it could be as simple as a few people who want to get together and say, like, do you want to learn this too? And that you decide to share who's going to ask the questions and the prompts, and that you decide to hold the space in a non-judgmental way, and that you make sure that people know that you're all coming to learn and learn to be connected to yourselves more. There's no right or wrong way to do that. But it really, like, I've heard book clubs practicing this. There's group therapy groups that people have started for,
Mm.
8 to 12 weeks where you're actually processing week by week through each chapter and getting a chance to not only experiment, but then talk about what the experimenting is like. And I think
Yeah.
that there can be varying degrees of formality of how you join groups. But I mean, even as simple as saying, like, if you're, let's just say you're in a church or you're in leading a staff meeting, or like have a gathering of a group of people for ceremony work, or you're sitting to have some sort of celebration, even just pausing to say, hey, let's take a moment to notice what's happening in our bodies can be such a great way to integrate tools and prompts like this into larger settings where maybe it's not the focus of the meeting, but you're remembering that as we gather, we're gathering as bodies, and let's center what's happening here to check in, to kind of cleanse the palate, to know what we're working with, to remember that our bodies can be consulted in group spaces, which often is not something that we do unless we're at a dance class or we're at a
Right.
like a whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
The book again is called Practices for Embodied Living, Experiencing the Wisdom of Your Body. Hillary, where can people interact with you or connect with you more if they want to do that?
Yeah. So my website, HillaryLMcBride.com. And then I probably hang out most on Instagram, Hillary Leanna McBride. And every once in a while I pop off on some other social media forums and threads and whatnot. But that's probably the one that I use the most. And I send out a newsletter maybe twice a year with stuff I have going on and coming up, because I do a lot of experiential stuff, as you can imagine, workshops and retreats and lectures and things like that. So you can find that there. And I've got a new book coming out in April, so have a look for that. It'll be April 2025. It's called Holy Hurt, and it's all about religious and spiritual trauma, which
Oh,
is so deeply connected to this material.
yes.
So if you're interested in this
Yes.
conversation, you're probably gonna like that.
I
Great.
think we will.
Mm.
I'd love to have you back on. Talk about
Totally,
that.
totally. Hillary, thanks for being with us today.
Such a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me and your thoughtful questions and engaging in my experiments. It feels so good to have done that with you.